Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Daily Volatility Box Report for October 10th, 2019. We are TOSindicators.com, home of the Volatility Box. For today's trading, nothing happened like we predicted. So in yesterday's video, we talked about how we thought there'd be a burst of volatility today, given how after-hours activity looked. To start off the morning, the S&P and the Dow also told us that we should be expecting a little bit more volatility than usual. And so I sent out a note letting everyone know essentially conditions to look for on the S&P and the Dow, and then that our focus was really on the NASDAQ and the Russell. And I thought that we would have gotten quite a few entries today. Unfortunately, we got none across the board. We had just 0 entries, and we were waiting and waiting. I think there was a point where the NASDAQ futures got fairly close to our entry, but we missed it by a few points, I think, before price started to reverse. All right, and so looking at tomorrow's events that are coming up, we don't really see anything too substantial on the calendar. We do have an FOMC member that's speaking towards the afternoon. It is a Friday. That's the only one caution sign that I would say to me if you are on the fence of which box to use to sway you towards the conservative volatility box. But tomorrow might be one of those days where we wait for that first hour test to give us the signs and see if we might have permission to continue to use the aggressive volatility box. And it's only if we get a news event or a tweet or something of that nature that is just adding a burst of volatility in the markets. That's where I think switching on over to the conservative volatility box will be useful. But otherwise, we don't really have anything on here that warns us to otherwise be conservative outside of the fact that it's just a Friday. And so use that to decide which box fits your risk tolerance the best. For us, I'll be looking at starting with the aggressive and then seeing if there are any signs to switch on over to the conservative if needed. And since we don't have too many trades to go over today, we'll also talk about what happened at Delta Airlines and talk about just our game plan from yesterday. So we had talked about how Delta Airlines has a tendency to fill its gap. We were looking for a gap up and for it to fill that gap, and we actually had the reverse. We had Delta Airlines gap down, and then we proceeded to fill that gap. So we'll just talk about what happened, any patterns that you might be able to glean from it. But first, let's start with the volatility box. So using our conservative volatility box, if we start with the S&P futures chart, let's walk through what I saw in the morning, which prompted me to send out a note alerting our users to focus on the NASDAQ and the Russell instead. And so within that first hour check, so by 7 o'clock, where we check to see whether or not we breached either side's volatility box entry lines, we see that on the S&P we had, right towards the end of the hour, we had breached. And so while we don't take end of hour entries, and definitely not entries in that first hour, this is free information to us. So that's how we treated this. For us, we wanted to see if we would get a follow through in the bearish direction, so as a short, before we saw our stop, if this were a normal trade, get hit, right? And so really what we're looking for is an equal and opposite move in the other direction that tells us that we are getting at least our follow through to T1. And so on the S&P and the Dow, we sent out alerts for levels that we were looking at. And so I think the level was somewhere down here for the S&P and up here, and we were checking to see which side hit first. Was it the upper side, which then told us this would have been a stop out, and therefore the S&P isn't being contained inside of the volatility box, or would it be this level down here, which would have been our first target, which then tells us that the S&P is giving us at least our first target. And so we ended up hitting both of these levels on the S&P and also the Dow. If we take a look, very similar thing where we hit our stop, or what would have been our stop, instead of our target first. And so that is a very easy way that we use to just filter out which markets we were paying attention to, which were the NASDAQ. And we see how the NASDAQ, we did really get close to breaching the conservative volatility box. And here is where we almost had that entry. Our order was parked at the cyan entry line, but we didn't actually hit where our order was parked. And so at the end of the hour, our orders were canceled. And so no trades that set up in the NASDAQ. With the Russell, there was something interesting. So I think we sent out a note in which we said to just use the conservative volatility box, but this is also an interesting pattern for the more aggressive trader. And so now if we switch on over to our aggressive volatility box on the Russell, we see that we had the same sort of breach at the end of the hour, except in the case of the Russell, you actually did see the follow through that you were looking for in the equal and opposite direction before you hit your stop. And so that to us could be then construed as a sign to use the aggressive volatility box. Of course, this is a little bit more aggressive, especially when you're using the aggressive box on the Russell, when you might be using, say, the conservative on the NASDAQ, and the markets are all different. But really, that's why we keep saying that each market has its own volatility personality and its conditions. That's why the models are unique. But regardless of which volatility box you used, you really didn't get an entry even on the Russell using the aggressive volatility boxes. So today, just no entries across the board in any of the indices. Okay, and now if we take a look at Delta Airlines, so I think this is a 3-year chart that we have plotted in which we have a total of 13 earnings that are included on this chart. We see that 9 of those 13 were gap fills, right? And an exorbitant amount of these 9, so 7 out of the 9, were gap ups, which is why our bias was towards the fact that if we had a gap up, we were looking for Delta Airlines to fill that gap. But another lesson that we could learn from this is the idea that really Delta Airlines just tends to fill its gaps, gap ups or gap downs. We see that it also filled 2 gap downs, and both of those gap downs, actually only one of those gap downs was on a miss, and one was on a beat, so that really doesn't give us any sort of information. Looking at what Delta Airlines actually ended up doing today, we could see that Delta Airlines' actual earnings was greater than its estimate, which tells us that Delta Airlines did beat, and so we gapped down, and so just using logic, that tells us that yes, we would expect to fill that gap on an earnings beat. And that's what this guy is right here. Gap down fills on beat. And so now if we come back to our 5-minute chart just to see and observe what price action actually looked like today. While we didn't get completely there in terms of filling the gap, we did get awfully close. So we gapped down and then we quickly started to make our way back up. And so if you use the information that Delta Airlines tends to fill its gaps more often than not, then you might have been able to participate in this move up. And while it may not have hit your final target, towards the close, you still had a fairly nice gain, I believe, basically of what the stock move would have been, which is, let's just say, from the open to the close, about 2.46%. And that's just using the information that's available based off of what actually tends to happen on the day of earnings for Delta Airlines. And so like this, we're just going to keep looking at future earnings that come up. We don't have anything that popped up in our scan today, but if we do and there's something that looks compelling, we'll try and talk about it in these nightly videos as well for those of you that trade only options or stocks. All right, so once again for today, absolutely no trades that's set up, and we'll look forward to trading tomorrow's volatility and see what Friday brings us. Again, protect your profits going into the week. Be aware that's a Friday, but also just follow the rules, follow the plan, and we'll see what the outcome ends up being. All right, take care, everyone.